Welcome back, everyone. I am Drew.
And I'm Eric.
And we are the Provisionist Perspective. So we're going a little bit off of our usual course of things. We want everyone to be persuaded of God's love and provision for everyone. That felt like a redundant statement there. But which includes people who are remarried, divorcees, everyone. No one's excluded from that. If you're watching this, God loves you, Christ died for you, and you can be saved. Now, much of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be addressing Christians. And 99.9% of our audience are born again followers of Jesus. And we're going to be talking about divorce and remarriage. This is a hot topic. I had
I'm excited.
We had a really good discussion last night with our housemates here in New Zealand about this. So I watched this sermon that we're about to get into and looked at it. And I feel like I've learned a lot. I've been challenged, but also my heart is heavy because this is a heavy topic. It affects all of us. Many of us personally, many of our close family members have been divorced. Maybe you're watching this and you've been divorced, a number of you. So this was kind of in response to a message from N.T. Wright on the gospel of reconciliation and divorce and remarriage just kind of came out of that. Yep. And then many of you said, do it some more. And so here we are.
Yeah, we were talking about how, what is the thing that would make the gospel spicier in our culture, that it was spicy in Paul's culture. And N.T. Wright was, I think, rightly admitting that when we go around preaching the gospel in our culture, people just give us tea, like brew us tea, or something. And it's not that spicy when we speak about these things. But what would make it spicier and what we came up with was the gospel of reconciliation towards marriage and divorce and what that looks like. And there was some great back and forth with our comment section. There's some great discussions going on in our comment section. This is something that I've personally been kind of hit with full in the face lately. The issue of divorce. I've moved out of my friends are being married stage, we're getting married stage. My friends are having young children stage, and we're moving into my friends are getting divorced stage. And how some of that stuff is going down and how the church is responding to this. Hint, it's very badly. We're going to address some of that. And it is controversial and it is sad, and it is worth some, not sober reflection, but some humility here, because by the grace of God go I, and we know that lots of people in our audience, this has personally affected them in some way or another, which is, I think, why we need to talk about it and not shy away from talking about it. And this guy gets really, really spicy. So I'm looking forward.
He's British and he's very monotone, but he's funny. And he hits it. It hurts. He does have.
He sits and he doesn't move the whole time.
Yeah, if you look closely. By the way, we'll put the link to this in the comments. You should watch the thing in its entirety. It's an hour and 44 minutes long, and you can see him sometimes. He's sitting there just completely stoic, but sometimes you can see his feet, like he does the feet jiggle thing.
I noticed that too. I put it on 1.5 times speed and it flew by for me. I couldn't stop watching it. So
yeah, it was good. Thanks, Scott, for asking. Scott says, Drew, how's the family? They're doing very well. Thank you for that. Baby girl is doing very well. Hey, Miss Susan, I believe that is. How you doing? By the way, throughout this broadcast, if you have some questions for us, the best way that we will see that is if you type in all caps question, or if you tag Provisionist Perspective like Susan has done right here. We will see super chats. You're able to do that if you want to, but we'll go ahead and crack into it here. I've got some timestamps, Eric. I don't know if you've taken any notes or if you're wanting to, go to particular time segments.
I didn't have any timestamps. There's definitely some things I wanted to address, but I'm sure you've got those going.
Sure. Yeah, so we'll just click play here, and we'll get rolling. Here it goes. Let me know if you can hear this.
Imperative, as we call it. It's an unconditional command. You don't do it.
Sorry, I feel like we should probably introduce this guy. So, to be fair, I don't really know much about him. His name's David Pawson. You'll notice that he's British. He has a lot of teachings. He just passed away last year, I believe. And I think his wife, I was told by a friend, passed away this year. So he's gone on to be with the Lord. And I'm sure that he's really happy about that. And so, yeah, here he is. He's going to tell us about divorce and remarriage. I got the book and skimmed through it a fair bit and read decent sections on it. It's good. If you can get a hold of it, you should. So I'll throw him back up here. But I felt like he probably needed a little bit of an introduction.
And in this way, he was upholding the sacredness of marriage, because all the commandments are upholding the sacredness of things. Or put it simply, all the commandments are about respect. Respecting God's name, respecting his day, respecting your parents, respecting life, respecting marriage, respecting property, respecting reputation. And if there's one thing that is characteristic of our society, it is the loss of respect, particularly respect for God-ordained authorities. But when you lose respect, a society will crumble. And so God in the Ten Commandments put respect at the heart of godly behavior, not just for God's sake, but for our sake, for community's sake. Those respects are absolutely vital. Well, now that's starting with what God said, what he said about marriage and what he said about betraying marriage with adultery. And the word adultery is only applied to illegitimate sin of a married person or with a married person. It's a word that I want to underline as something that purely applies to married people. God uses other words for sexual sins outside marriage, but that's the serious one because it betrays a covenant that you have made in God's sight. Let me move on to what Moses said. There is one passage in the Bible in which Moses talks about divorce.
So we'll pause that there for now. Sven is asking, you don't see the link to the sermon, so we'll put it in the description afterwards. It's not up there now, but we'll make sure it gets down there.
You're supposed to be listening to us first anyway.
Yeah.
Sven, I don't know what.
Stay tuned. So he said, so basically here, I just thought this was a worthy of some attention here, where he talks about respecting different things and respecting godly, God's authority in our lives, and how it's all of God's commands are a community issue. It's for the health of the people. They're not arbitrary or anything like that. And he also says that adultery, so he's kind of defining terms to start off with here. And he says adultery is exclusively something that only married people can commit. Now we can have a conversation about Matthew 5 and Jesus talking about lust of the heart, but this will come into some of his argument later on. Did you want to say anything else about that clip, Eric?
Yeah, and just his definition, he emphasizes it because it's very important to what his argument is. Why adultery is, you can't call any sexual sin adultery. You can only call the sexual sin of a married person or with a married person adultery. That becomes very important for him later. Yeah.
I don't know if he wants me to say his name on here, but that noise that you heard was a text from Sven, who I know. So, but I won't call you out, but I appreciate you listening, brother. If you want me to say your name, I can, but maybe you want to stay anonymous. I get that. So here he's going to talk about Moses, what Moses has to say on this topic.
And remarriage. It's in Deuteronomy 24. And still Christians argue about this passage because it's considered to apply to Christians, but I don't believe it does. Nevertheless, Deuteronomy 24 shows that Moses allowed divorce. and remarriage. He accepted it for the Israelites, and he legislated for it. He told them, if you divorce your wife, you write out a bill of divorce and you give it to her, and that gives her the freedom to find another partner. And this was quoted to Jesus by people when they were discussing it with him. And they quoted Deuteronomy. It's part of the law of Moses. It's part of the Israeli culture. And so there's been a big debate about Deuteronomy 24. When you read it carefully, it doesn't forbid divorce, and it doesn't forbid second or even third marriages. What it does prohibit is that if a woman is divorced, marries another and is divorced again, she must not return to her first husband and marry him again. That's all that's prohibited in Moses' law. That's the only legislation he made. And he said it will defile the land if you go back to your first husband and remarry him. Now, this is still in Deuteronomy. And I want to emphasize that I don't believe I'm under Moses' laws. If I was, I'm breaking them at this moment. He said, you must never wear cloth that is mixed material. And I got this in a modern shop that mixes cotton and wool with polystyrene, and I don't know what else, but I'm wearing a mixture of material. I'm disobeying Moses' law.
So he's a funny guy. He's got that real stoic delivery there of these lines. And he said polystyrene. I think what he meant was polyester. Polystyrene is another word for styrofoam. I don't think there's styrofoam in his suit. Who knows, right? There may very well be. And so he's basically just highlighting, and we can get into I don't want to get sidetracked by the comments about I'm not beholden to the law of Moses and all of that, although this has elicited some thinking in my own mind on that subject that I would like to kind of firm up more. But basically his only point here is to say that this passage was brought up to Jesus, and Moses gives permission in this regard. And Aaron Pilkey makes a good comment here. He says, Moses allowing it does not equal to God allowing it. Moses isn't God. So we're going to look at that as to whether God allows divorce or not. But that's a valid point for this particular passage. And his main argument is that it prohibits remarrying the first spouse. So Moses seems to, I guess the point that I wanted to draw from this, Eric, and I'll see if you're in agreement. We both watched this. We think we're mostly in agreement, but we might not be. I don't know. The point that I wanted to draw from this was that it establishes the biblical precedent for the second marriage dissolving the first. And that's why you're not permitted to go back to the first covenant, because the second marriage dissolved or broke the covenant. And that's the main question of the day surrounding this topic that we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that breaks the covenant of marriage? That's ultimately the question that we're trying to answer regarding divorce and remarriage. Do you want to?
Yeah, it just seems like the church right now kind of just thinks anything can break that covenant if you just don't like the person anymore, or because it's so funny. What just happened was Adele just had a special with Oprah, right, on NBC or something, and where she sat down with Oprah and then performed. And I love Adele, and whatever that says about me, I don't know. But I think Adele's music is great. I think that song "Go Easy on Me" is overrated, and her ethic, her morals in that song are atrocious. But and she kind of expounds on that with Oprah about she got divorced not because she didn't love him anymore, but because she wasn't in love with him anymore. And that's literally what she said, that she wanted this passionate relationship and it just wasn't there anymore. And the church would be like, we have to be honest with ourselves. And you can say, if the shoe fits, right? If your church isn't okay with it and you've seen your church take action against a spouse trying to divorce for those reasons, and your church does some church discipline. First, I don't believe you. But two, if that actually is true, then that's great. And you're your church is one of the exceptions, even though I don't believe you. So, but if your church does that, great. The shoe doesn't fit. But I'm going to say the church at large, like, kind of goes, yeah, Adele's right. You can just divorce for any reason. And there's never any church discipline around this. They may go, oh, yeah, Adele shouldn't have said that, or, oh, that's a bad ethic, but they don't do anything about it. They don't tell spouses not to divorce for the same reasons Adele divorced, and subjected her son to divorce. So this is like all happening all in the culture right now, and the church is kind of like, oh, yeah, going along with it. And this guy's going to push back against what we all see all our churches doing all the time. And he makes some great there's some oof moments in this. So
yeah, we'll get into it. Here he goes again. He'll continue.
3 children, but I'm afraid they won't all be yours. And one day she's going to go back on.
Sorry. So what he's talking about here, I must have got the timestamp wrong, but he's using here. Let me just back it up just a couple of seconds here and make sure I get he's talking about Hosea here, that this is an example of divorce and remarriage in the Bible.
Well, that quite pleased him, but then God added, I want you to marry a prostitute. What? Preacher marries prostitute. Headlines. But he married her. And God said, you'll have 3 children, but I'm afraid they won't all be yours. And one day she's going to go back on the streets and leave you. And you ought to go after her and find her again and buy her back from the pimp controlling her, bring her back to the house, discipline her, and then love her again. And then what, Lord? Then you can go and tell Israel, that's how I feel about her. It's an amazing little prophecy. What a thing that the prophet was called to do, to demonstrate God's feelings. But it tells you something. Go and get her back again. Discipline her, forgive her, and love her all over again. That's how I feel. And then we turn to Jeremiah.
It's interesting. My timestamps are a little bit off, and I'm usually pretty perfectionist about this. So I don't know if you know what? I've opened the wrong video.
I was gonna say that's the option right there.
Yeah. Oh well, we're more or less on track. Maybe here.
But do you see? I mean, you can search the new video, and if you want to mess with that, or we'll just keep going. But can you see the case he's building here? Right, the case he's building is that you don't get to. He's going to start saying you don't get to just immediately divorce because of adultery. That's not the ethic of marriage. That's not how God feels about marriage. That's not how what he told Hosea to do. And you don't, and the ethic, the push is you get her back. You get her back. You honor your vow. You honor your covenant that you made with your wife or your husband, and you get them back. That is the ethic he's running off on. That's the push he's going to make, and that's the case he's going to keep making here.
Yeah, and I think, oops, I'm working on getting this queued up and stuff again, but he's going to go on to make a few other examples here. And what I think is interesting for this discussion, Eric, and I don't really want to open this can of words in terms of discussion, but if you're in our Soteriology 101 discussion group, I created a poll because I wanted to see if there was a correlation.
I know what you're going to do here. I get it. I know what you're going to
do.
Go ahead.
The eternal security being that God is not willing to divorce us. And so I figured if there are people who believe that God's not willing to divorce us or doesn't, that's not something that he does, which it seems like he's going to make the case. And David Pawson's not once saved, always saved, mind you. So I thought that there would be an interesting correlation here with that, and could be something that we talk about at a later stage, but that's just a little morsel for your pudding. I don't know if that's a word, but I just made it up. So Aaron's got a question here. He says, in Matthew 5:22, isn't fornication being the only exception in relation to the espousal period only? We're going to get to that. Just hang on, Aaron. We're headed there. We're going to get there. So here we go. He's going to talk about Jeremiah.
And then we turn to Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah 8, God says, relating to Israel's awful sin, I'm divorcing you. I'm going to write out a bill of divorcement, and you're to get out of this land, you're to go to Babylon, because I'm finished with you. But that's not the last word. If it were, then people who argue that if God can divorce, they can, would be wrong. Because later in Jeremiah, God says, but I'm going to bring you back. What Hosea did, God said, I'll do with Israel. I'll bring you back from Babylon. So he wasn't splitting with her forever. It was a temporary divorce. And he would bring her back, and he would not marry another. And he made her a promise that they would live together again, which is not the kind of divorce that we're thinking of. And then Malachi.
Yes. So he's going to go on to talk about Malachi. The only really thing that he has to say about Malachi is that the last Old Testament prophet, second to last, I guess, or Old Covenant, if John the Baptist is the last one, says God hates divorce. And he just reiterates the same thing that he did with Hosea, was that in Jeremiah, he was going to issue a certificate of, he did issue a certificate of divorce to Israel, but then his stated intention is, but I will bring you back and we will be reconciled. So there were basically three different schools of thought. One was that adultery alone broke the covenant. One was that basically if your wife offended you, then you could divorce her.
Right.
if she offended you, or if you didn't like her. And then the third,
like if she cooked you a meal you didn't like, if she cooked you a meal you didn't like, you could divorce her.
Even more than that, there was a school of thought that came later that was even more liberal after Jesus' time. That was basically you can get divorced for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. So those are the schools there's debate among rabbis, right? And then they are trying to catch Jesus in all of this, and he's going to talk a little bit about that.
Really, to get Jesus into trouble. But they were also interested in, is he going to take the strict line, adultery only, like Shammai, or will he take a more liberal line like Hillel, or will he take his own line? So let's begin to look at what Jesus said, because for the Christian, I believe that's the most important question. We're followers of Jesus, and what he said on this subject should go for every Christian. Now, there's no doubt about it that Jesus was against divorce and remarriage. But I want to look at three aspects of this. First, I want to look at his explanation for that negative attitude, which he gives us in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark. Then, having looked at his explanation for his attitude, I want to look at the exception he made to his rule. For he did make one exception, and that's the center of Christian discussion today. I'm sorry that people, when they discuss what Jesus said about divorce, go straight for the exception and try and enlarge the loophole to include most divorces and remarriages. But an exception always refers to a minority of cases. Otherwise, it would be the rule. But we shall look at the exception which occurs in Matthew.
So he's going to go on to talk a little bit about Matthew and kind of who it's addressed to and stuff. And so here he's basically just highlighting that it was a trick question that Jesus was put in.
I'm struck by the contrast. The most challenging aspect of me is the contrast between God hates divorce. Jesus is against divorce, period. And then there's like this exception. But churches don't preach that. And we don't talk about it like that. In fact, we don't talk about it at all.
Mm.
And then when elders, longstanding church members, people in authority, even pastors, go through divorce, it's all
Right.
and then maybe that person kind of goes away, and maybe it's just treated as this one big exception, that there's always a good enough reason for it. When we should be starting with this discussion starts with God hates it and Jesus is against it, period.
And I think that was his point, and why I wanted to bring this clip in here is because he says that he reckons it's really tragic that we run straight to the exception and want to more or less enlarge it to include all manner of different things, which he'll go on to explain is quite narrow. And you know that, and so consequently, it's kind of as though there's an unwritten. We don't talk about this. We know that there's an exception, and the exception is more or less big. And also, the phrase that I get kind of frustrated with in these discussions is the phrase, "But there is grace." Don't worry. There's grace. There is forgiveness. And I'm 100% down with grace. I'm 100% down with forgiveness. That's one of the things he'll talk about towards the end of his talk here. But saying there is forgiveness, there is grace doesn't really tell us about what Jesus, more specifically.
So Jordan says, this is why God hates it, meaning divorce. Someone is sinning. I think it's more than that. I think he hates it because it goes against who he is, what his relationship with us is, and also it goes against who we are. That it's not how we're made for relationship. It's not. It's not somebody just sinning. It's somebody breaking a covenant. It's somebody breaking a vow, and that just offends him deeply. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. All those things we can think of about the strength of covenants and vows. I think it's much stronger than somebody's committed a sin, because that's where there's grace for sins, right? Comes in. We're under grace in Jesus, right? That's where that comes in, to excuse almost anything, almost any reason for no longer liking that person. So Jordan, I'm not saying that's what you were saying specifically, that you were trying to give excuses for it. I don't think you are. I'm just saying I think he hates it. I think it's even stronger as to why he hates it.
And I'm just gonna throw this in the chat here so that I can get it out in front of us. This is the passage that's in Malachi. For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
All right, there you go.
For it covers one's garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore, take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. So it covers one's garment with violence is a pretty strong, I think it could be argued that not each and every sin covers your garment with violence. But I just thought I would throw that up here since we didn't talk about that.
The other thing that I want to say about this is I don't want this to come off as, we're two young guys who are taking this flippantly and we're still in the honeymoon stages of our marriage, right? Like, I've been married 14
You're
years.
not in the honeymoon stage at all.
No, we've been married 14 years and it'll be 15 soon. And we almost didn't make it to year 3. Okay. And there has been really, really tough stuff in our marriage. And there are times we didn't even like each other. So I don't take this flippantly. Again, this is something that's been presented on my doorstep of friends of mine in deep suffering because of this. And so I'm not being idealistic about this at all. I really think we need to, as Christians, And I think that there's a place where I want to say where I think Pawson is wrong. And I almost want to, like, when I go on this and we discuss this, I won't, like, almost want to clip it and make it its own thing, because it's going to be later on. But like, I think there's something that Pawson misses, and I think we can recapture this because I think we need to, or our people are just going to be in constant suffering.
That's a good teaser. I don't know what Eric's going to say there, but we'll stay tuned here towards the end to find out. Let's keep him rolling here.
So the explanation is in Mark and Luke. The exception is in Matthew. And then we shall look thirdly at the example of Jesus, which you find in John. So that's our little structured outline for what Jesus said. First of all, his explanation. Why was he against divorce and remarriage? And the answer is really very simple. You find it most plainly stated in Luke, where he said to the Pharisees, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another is committing adultery. And anyone who marries a divorcee is committing adultery. Now, the interesting thing about that simple statement in Luke is this. He called remarriage after divorce adultery. He said remarrying after divorce is breaking the seventh commandment. But the significance of that is this. If adultery can only be committed by a married person, then a person who is divorced and remarried is still married to the first partner in God's sight. Now that's so important. I want you to really grasp that. If getting divorced and marrying someone else is adultery, it means that in God's sight, the divorce is not valid. That person is still married. And therefore, when they have sex with another partner in a remarriage, they're committing adultery against the first partner. That's his explanation of why he was so strong about divorce and remarriage. He said it's breaking the fundamental commandment of God not to commit adultery. It's the sin of a married person. So divorce has not dissolved the marriage. It has not ended the first marriage. That's a very important thing to realize. In Jesus' sight, and therefore in God's sight, a divorce does not end a marriage. The person is still married, and therefore remarriage becomes adultery for that reason. Now that's the rule of Jesus. That's his general rule before he made an exception. But that's the rule that we need to get hold of. Remarriage is adultery.
Oof. You want to start on that one, Eric?
I have a big bias against this view. I'm not saying I think he's wrong. My bias is that when I was a young Christian and I just was involved in a youth group and involved with a certain set of friends and leaders. One of the leaders, who I still consider a friend, and who has not so recently, not fairly recently, helped me, and is a truly, a great man of God, and does amazing things for the kingdom. I'm talking about amazing, huge things for the kingdom. Okay. I'm not talking anyway. He's divorced and remarried, and he was at the time. And I knew both partners, and I knew both families. And I never thought any differently of it. I just thought this guy was amazing leader, Bible study leader. mentor. And somebody in our group got a legalistic bugaboo and tried to destroy him on this fact, quoting these exact same things and taking this exact same position, and attempted to get him removed from leadership. And this brother ended up exploding on everybody, leaving the friend group and eventually apostatizing. And this is what started him down this path.
So the accuser ended up forsaking the faith. But so he was a leader, just like a lay leader in the youth.
He was highly thought of, very intelligent, well-read. And he read this and got a hold of it, and it sent him down a path where he didn't return, as in a kind of legalistic. And so I have a bias to overcome in accepting this view. Yeah. This is not easy for me to deal with here.
It does hit home. And I think I think that I'm in agreement with him here. And I think that, we'll talk more about this later. I do disagree with what he's going to conclude on the end, which Tatiana here in the chat has agreed to, has, highlighted. But it does seem like when Jesus says, and maybe we should just pull it up. But by the way, I would encourage you, I don't know how much time, I do know how much time we're going to have, but I don't know how long this is going to take. Go back and read these verses and study them. Do your own study on the subject. It's an important subject. So it's important to look directly at the Word of God on this matter. But Jesus says, let me just pull it up, because I feel like this is doing injustice to just sort of paraphrase it.
Tatiana here is saying, meeting nice remarried Christians into passing their sins. Well, no, but as a youth, I'm in high school at this time. I'm new and being active in my faith. I grew up in the church, but it was making it my own and everything like that. I didn't have a capacity to, and I'm not excusing my ignorance or my passing it over. It's just that this was my experience, that this brother took this truth and attempted to wreck people who I admired, and then eventually shipwrecked his own faith. And this is the thing that started him down the path. So that I was just telling my story as to how I'm biased against it. What is compelling, though, why I am compelled by it, is that something he says at the beginning is that the church is perfectly fine with serial monogamy, that we are totally fine with polygamy as long as you have the relationships consecutively. The church is fine with it. And that is true. And that is awful. And it is sinful. And the church needs to repent and do something different here. And if this is it, if this is the stance we need to take, then I'm for it. I just don't want to go into it blindly and or legalistically, or try to beat people over the head with this. And I don't think Pawson does that. Pawson doesn't do that. He goes on to not do that. But that's where I'm sort of battling with this.
So as Jordan was saying earlier, this is an important topic and we don't want to get this wrong. As we introduce it, as I said, my heart's heavy, being that I also don't want to be wrong about this, but I feel like I'm landing somewhere that puts me in a bit of a precarious position with people around me. It's an unpopular position to take. And I guess I wanted to show this. This is the passage in Luke 16 where it says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. So he established that adultery is only something a person who is married can commit. So and we're going to talk about the exception. If someone is committing adultery, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, then that means that they're still viewed as married in God's sight. And I don't know how to get around that. That seems like a strong case. That seems like what Jesus is saying. Again, the question is going to be, we got to come back to, what is it that breaks the covenant of marriage? If there's something that breaks it, if it's adultery, then you're not married anymore because the covenant is broken. If you're dead, then your spouse isn't married to you anymore. The covenant is broken. You're released from that. So again, that's kind of one of the main questions that we need to ask ourselves.
And we need to ask it because the church isn't asking it.
Yes, right.
And by and large, the church isn't asking what are the exceptions. The church is just everything is an exception. The church, this is a sobering condemnation of the sin of the evangelical church right now that we all need to come to terms with and deal with. And it's that the church is totally fine with polygamy as long as you have those relationships consecutively. That is true. And it's an indictment. And we need to repent.
Right.
Talking to myself here too.
Yeah. And one thing that I would like to get into more on this, and this is ultimately why we're here, or what started us on this journey, is we don't even have a system in place for this. We don't do church discipline, and we don't have elders. But let's be honest, how many of our churches have biblical elders? That's beginning to be a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. I think it's really important, and it's really integral to this process here of taking this seriously. But
that's once he makes his case, I want to get into church discipline. I think that's the other side of this. We can't do any of this without church discipline. So
that's why I've called my book Remarriage is Adultery Unless.
Thumbnail inspiration.
And the unless allows for an exception. And Jesus did make an exception. Let's turn to that now in Matthew. In Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, there's a little clause, except in the case of. In both passages, he is saying the same basic thing. Remarriage after divorce is adultery, except in the case of. And this is where we run into deep waters. And this is where Christians are divided. And there's an awful lot of discussion. I have about 25 books on divorce and remarriage on my shelves, all holding different views and all written by evangelical Christians. The confusion on this issue is widespread. And that means that you can always find an evangelical pastor who will agree with your remarriage.
Here you go.
You just need to shop around. And because there's such a variety in understanding Jesus' words, just go around the pastors until you find one who'll agree with you and remarry you, or at least accept you into church membership after you're remarried. That's the result of today. And I'm afraid now with cars, automobiles, every Christian has a choice of at least 40 churches, if not more. And you've got 1,000 churches, I gather, in Kansas City and district. You can just shop around and change churches when you don't like one. That's made church discipline impossible, because you just shop around until you find a church that'll accept you. I wish churches would get together and discipline their members together so that what one church does, the other churches will back up. But that's not the case now. We've got this huge variety of opinion. And if you are divorced and want to remarry, you won't have any difficulty finding a church that'll do it for you. But
basically, I just wanted to highlight here, he's going to talk a little bit about church discipline later. He talks about shopping around churches, and he says, I wish that churches would get together on this issue. But let's be honest, on this issue, this is a hard issue to unite around. I mean, if you talk about even interdenominational issues and having church discipline somebody for, say, adultery, and they've departed, but then they just go to another church. Then when you're talking about this issue of divorce and remarriage, getting other churches to unite around that's going to be quite challenging. But I think that has to be part of this process. It just has to. And I wanted to highlight what Tatiana has said here above. She said, if the church taught the truth on this, they would have empty pews. David Pawson is teaching to a very large congregation here and in IHOP in Kansas City. And if you watch the full thing, I don't think we'll get it here. They applaud him at one state for giving them the truth. And I think people are hungry for the truth. And I think that one thing that attracted me to the church that I attended throughout my college years was they started stepping on my toes a little bit. And I thought, oh, this is different. They're kind of getting in my grill. And ultimately, if we have empty pews, then we have empty pews. I don't know. We have to do what's healthy for the church and what's healthy for the people.
I'm glad you picked this out because I saw this. I don't even think this is true. If you want why has Reformed theology resurged in the last 10 years? Why? Because they took there was this Rick Warren Saddleback Church easy believism, and they were a reaction against the Jesus is my friend, I'm going to sing about Jesus as my boyfriend. And they went, no, Jesus is Lord. Theology is important. And here are some ancient and established confessions that we can all rally around and take theology very, very seriously and have this renewed reverence for God and for the intellectual side of Christian faith. And that we're not going to treat our young people and our young adults like they're infants, and we're actually going to feed them theological meat. And here we are. They own the internet, and the young, restless, and reformed is what it is. I think there's room for this here. That if you want something truly countercultural, this is it. If you want something that is truly difficult, but that the church can rally around, and it will bring people in to see that we're different than the culture actually. This is it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine, Tatiana, to your point, if the church was taking a hard stance on this, it would be noticed. And that was kind of what birthed this whole conversation from our last broadcast was, what are we known for? Let's keep trucking here and see what else he has to say about it.
It's Jesus we're dealing with, not pastors. And Jesus made one exception to his rule, that remarriage after divorce is adultery. And it's about that exception that we have so much variety of opinion and so much discussion. Excuse me. The real problem at the basis of this exception is that Jesus didn't use the word adultery. He used a quite different word, a word that is translated in the King James Version as fornication. It's not the word adultery. And yet many modern versions have assumed that he made the exception of adultery. The New International Version, the NIV, the nearly infallible version, I call it.
I call it the nearly inspired version.
Has, except for marital infidelity, which is simply another way of saying adultery. And this is now a widely accepted meaning of that word. But why didn't Jesus use the word? Because he does use it in the very next sentence. Whoever marries the divorced person is committing adultery. So he knew the word. But he didn't make that word the exception. To give you the Greek version, in case you want to look it up, the word for adultery, the sin of a married person, is moichaia. And the word that Jesus used for the exception is porneia, from which we get our word pornography. And the word porneia has about it a kind of commercial sense, sex for money. It was used of prostitution, it was used of brothels. And it really meant sex for money, but it was a wider word than that. Now, there are three different possibilities for treating that word porneia or fornication. And that's where all the problems arise. And the three possibilities, I'm going to be quite honest with you and give you all three possible interpretations, and then tell you which one convinces me. The first possibility.
So for time's sake, I thought I would just abbreviate his explanation here. By the way, Miss Susan, I saw your question up top, and I want to answer that, but that will become more relevant towards the end of the broadcast. So I want to get back around to that. If you're still tuned in, remind me towards the end, and hopefully I'll just remember anyways if you don't happen to be here. But so he basically says that there are three different views. One view is that porneia, because the exception says except in the case of fornication or except in the case of sexual morality, that this word porneia means only adultery, or it means sexual immorality. It's an expanded definition, which can be adultery or things like masturbation, obviously things like pornography, and so on. So it's an expanded definition. Or he says it is specifically a sin that only single people can commit. Only people that are not in a marriage covenant can commit. And that's his position on the issue. Do you want to
meaning that the marriage was invalid to begin with?
Well, that's not his argument, I don't think.
Yes. He's saying that Jesus was speaking to a Jewish culture which in the past had the father have to prove the virginity of the woman. And
with a bloody sheet, he says.
With a bloody sheet. And if she wasn't, then the marriage was off. It was invalid.
Right.
So he's saying if the marriage is invalid, then it's invalid. Like it never happened. It was never valid. And so that's an exception.
That's interesting because
isn't that what you're saying?
That's not how I understood him. I understood him to be saying that, for instance, in the case of Mary and Joseph, when she was pregnant with Jesus, what she had committed was, well, what in everyone's mind she had committed was sex with another man before she was married, i.e. fornication, sexual immorality. And so when Joseph found out about that, he was permitted to divorce her and to leave her and to not marry her. So they weren't covenanted. They weren't married yet. They were on their way to be married. And it was much more serious than even our own engagement. But I didn't really understand him as saying that it was invalid. I understood him as saying that basically this is a situation that Jesus is talking about exclusively for Jews. And that as far as I can tell, there isn't any modern parallel to this. Would be my understanding of what
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. That in Jewish culture, this invalidated marriage.
Right.
Marriage, sex before marriage invalidated the marriage. And so he's speaking to the culture and saying that's a case. But since we don't have that parallel, we can't justify it in the same way.
I thought it was more of if you find out before you get married, then you're divorced. But I guess it does make sense to say that if you have sex with your wife and you discover that she's not a virgin, then you're permitted. And it's interesting in a patriarchal society how that can't really work the other way around.
Right. Yeah, it can't. It doesn't work the other way around in a society. So, I mean, I think that if I could draw a parallel here, what Jesus is pushing back against is their cultural more that you can divorce for any reason. That if she makes you a meal you don't like, she's gone.
Right.
And that was the patriarchal situation of the day. Today, I think, and here we go, let's do it. I think we have a matriarchal situation today where a woman in the evangelical church can do literally anything and get away with it in terms of a justification for divorce. That a women who files for 60% of all divorces, that they, in terms of in the eyes of the church, women can't be criticized in this way. That they basically have, all a woman has to do is basically say, my husband was mean. And there isn't a church elder who will stand up to her and tell her she cannot get divorced.
Well, and this brings us to what are the things that break the covenant, or what are the exceptions? Because many people would say that an exception is abuse. Now, in terms of being mean, and that can take, obviously varying different degrees. I don't believe that that's an exception that can be substantiated by Scripture. I do believe that you should get out, and that you should go the church discipline route and seek and hope for reconciliation. I'm not saying stay with. Now, in the ancient world, did they have that option?
Of course.
No. And then, actually, no, we did talk about this last night. We talked about this last night, that likely, especially in the church, you would like to think there was an auntie or uncle that could take you in, or mom and dad and stuff like that. So, yeah, this is a good segue into what he's going to say next. I wanted to play this. It's a relatively short clip, but it's related to this matriarchal thing, I think.
To the biggest church in the country that claims to be the biggest church in the world. And in fact, the pastor was on his third marriage. And I heard that was beginning to be shaky as well. And nobody says a thing. The pastor simply carries on. But I did go to another large church in that same country where they discipline members properly, scripturally. And they were excommunicating a member, a lady in the church, who was determined to leave her husband and marry another man. And the church said, no, you can't do that and remain a member in this church. She will almost certainly go down the road and find another church. But guess which church is getting all the publicity in the press? The one where the pastor is on his third wife, or the church that disciplines a member for determined to marry someone she isn't entitled to? Well, it's the church that is disciplining, that everybody's gossiping around. What a world we live in. It's a crazy world, isn't it? In fact, because people are now consumer Christians, they simply shop around from one church to another till they find one they like, and discipline becomes impossible. When a church disciplines a member for anything, they simply change churches to another that will accept them. But discipline is a mark of a New Testament church. It's not an individual decision. The way we behave is of concern to the community. And there are examples in the New Testament of churches disciplining membership. Well, now, all this...
So here he's basically saying, and good on them, good on this church for saying, no, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to be a member here. We're going to start this process of discipline with you. Good on them for doing that. It's unfortunate that he's right. All she has to do is find another church, another pastor or whatever else that agrees with her views, and then she can just go there. That's really unfortunate, but good on them. And I think that this is something that should be done. And this is something that, as you've pointed out, Eric, happens left and right. I mean, we've expanded the exception clause as wide as a semi truck, and good on him for this point. And it's interesting that he points out that there's this big, huge church who he doesn't name that has a pastor who's on their third marriage, and yet what we talk about and what is controversial to us is that this woman is coming underneath discipline for leaving her husband and not being willing to be reconciled to him. So yeah.
Here's where I disagree with Pawson, and then I'll give you my view, and everybody in the comment sections can slam me and you can slam me. It's fine. I'm not that willing. Maybe this is me being ideological and naive. I'm not willing to give up on church discipline. I don't think it's impossible in a local sense with social media and the ability to connect on a level unlike anything before. How easy would it be to have some sort of ministry like Glassdoor, which is a site where people who work for companies can go on there anonymously and tell the truth about their companies and the culture of their companies. How easy would it be to set up some sort of situation like that, have local relationships with the churches in your area, and to be able to warn them and tell them about people in your communities who have done this, and to do church discipline, to let the other congregations in the area know that you are doing this, and to have that be social media supported, or in some way this is just as there's conferences, just as there's books, just as there's organizations, we could do all of that. And we've united under certain theological views. We've united under this, and there's weekend conferences, week-long conferences on this stuff. There's huge resources with all this money poured into them for things that are important for people to solidify around in the Christian faith. Why not this? Why not this? Why doesn't this get treated the same, with the same fervor in the same way, and have the same resources behind it? We could totally do it and make it possible for people to have to think twice, knowing that if they do this kind of thing, they're not going to be able to just go. It's going to be harder than that. Just going next door and finding somebody to agree with them.
And I think that your example of the social media, thing notwithstanding, I think it starts with repentance. It starts with, okay, let's do this. How are we going to do this? Let's talk about how we're going to do this. Let's make some attempts to just do this and do it. And then if that person goes to another church, then that just is what it is. Maybe that's where it starts. And then what does that look like from there? I think that's a question that we can ask.
So here's a good one. If someone remarried and then is convicted of adultery afterwards, should they separate from their second wife and kids and pray to be reconciled to their first? I don't know. And do you have a clip of him talking about the unbeliever Paul's exception?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, for sure. So,
because it'll do Paul's exception, and we're going to get kind of the whole view of his view here.
Find another ground than the one Jesus made for an exception. And he claimed to have found it in Paul's writings. Now, there are three relevant passages in Paul to this issue. One is Romans chapter 7, where Paul takes exactly the same line as Jesus and says, if a woman divorces and remarries, she is called an adulteress. And marriage is for life, and we are only released from it by the death of a partner. That's in Romans 7. But in 1 Corinthians 7, he says much, much more. And it's in that chapter that Erasmus found a second exception, namely desertion. And since Erasmus was teaching at the time of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther picked up this second exception. So did Calvin. So did the Reformed churches and the Lutheran churches, which have since taught two exceptions, one from Jesus, one from Paul. One from Jesus, fornication, whatever that is, and one from Paul, desertion. And he did it because Paul says, if a woman is married, if anyone is married to an unbeliever, presumably because the one has become a believer after the marriage, and it's an unequal yoke, what should the believer do? And he says the believer must not divorce, must not leave the marriage. But he said, if the unbeliever wants to get out of the marriage, let him go. Let him go. And on that basis, Erasmus said, so desertion is a ground for divorce, especially since Paul goes on to say the believer is not bound. And Erasmus said, there you are. The bond of marriage is released when the unbeliever deserts. Notice that it has to be an unbeliever, not another believer. But he said, if an unbelieving partner wants out, let him go, because the believer is not bound. And he interpreted that to mean is free to remarry someone else. But it's a mistranslation. The verb for bound is nothing like the word Paul uses everywhere and in the same chapter for the marriage bond. The word he actually uses is enslaved. Marriage, says Paul, is not slavery, and the verb is used in the past tense, referring to the wedding in the past, not to the future marriages. And referring to the wedding in the past, he says, for the believer was not enslaved in the marriage. It's not the same thing as slavery. That's why the believer should let the unbeliever go. But Paul is not discussing what their future is at all. When you look at the rest of the chapter, Paul takes the same harsh line as Jesus did. Earlier in the chapter, he says, husbands must not divorce their wives. Wives must not divorce their husbands. And he titles that, I'm not telling you this from myself, this is what the Lord said. And so he makes that strong statement, no divorce, on the basis of the Lord Jesus' teaching. In between those two statements, some versions translate this statement, but if she does separate, let her remain single or be reconciled to her husband. And many have misunderstood that because, again, it's in the past tense. And what he was saying, wives, you must not divorce your husband. But if you are already separated, if you are already divorced, the options are to remain single or be reconciled to your former married partner. But he does not say you're free to marry again. He is thinking of the case where somebody has become a Christian who is already divorced. And he says the options are remain single or be reconciled. And 1 Corinthians 7 ends with an absolutely clear statement that only death can set a person free from the marriage bond, different word. And then he adds, but though you are free, you must marry someone who's a fellow Christian, another believer. Otherwise, you are deliberately forming an unequal yoke with an unbeliever.
No, I just, I wonder at this. I wonder at what he would say to. I think I know his answer, because he's not saying unbelieving desertion. Okay, here's what I'm wondering about. I'm wondering about a situation in which you actually have church discipline. This only works in a situation with church discipline.
Right.
Where, let's say you have a man who is, emotionally, verbally abusing his wife. They separate. It's not healthy. It's not healthy for the kids. It's not healthy for her. And so they're separated. And he's brought under church discipline for this behavior, for this sin against his wife and his family. But he's unrepentant, and he becomes angry and essentially apostatizes and will not listen to reason, and shipwrecks his faith and leaves. Is he now an unbeliever, which she can now let go? He doesn't want anything to do with her. He's gone. He's not trying to reconcile. He's not repentant. He's been brought under church discipline. They've gone through the Matthew 5 steps, and he's now been sent off into outer darkness for the destruction of his flesh, so that his soul may be restored. But he's still in that place of being cast out. The church members have been instructed not to associate with him, not to eat with him. He is anathema, and that's where he is, and he's essentially an unbeliever. Is she free now to stay single? It sounds like yes. Is she free to remarry? Sounds like Pawson would say no.
Yeah, that's my understanding of what he's saying. And this particular topic hits home directly for me. I know that he'll be watching this eventually. A friend of mine he's married to a woman who was once married to he is married to a divorced woman. Probably my best friend, really great friend. And he did some research into this, and this is a common view, I guess, in addition to maybe the adultery view, is desertion. And I understand why people think that is what Paul is saying here. And many translations translate this word as bound, is no longer bound or whatever. And Pawson's point is that the word is not the same, that the word is enslaved, and that word is in reference to your marriage, towards the marriage that you're in. So that person has left. They're an unbeliever. They leave you. They don't want to be with you anymore. God's called you to peace. So let them go. You are not enslaved. And not even you are not, it's you have not been enslaved. So in the covenant, you're not enslaved. You're not obligated to force this person to stay with you, to try to coax them to stay around. And he makes an interesting practical point that letting them depart, instead of really coaxing them and trying to get them to stay, makes them more amenable towards Christianity than they would be otherwise. Because even Paul says, how do you know whether or not you will save your husband? Or how do you know whether or not you will save your wife? Right. And so his point is that this is a different word. It's used in the past tense, but I understand why people see it that way. I do think that I've come to disagree with that position, but I get it. In the context, it would seem like then he talks about not being bound later on, and then but again, it's not the same. It's not the same Greek word. And Pawson would say that he reckons that it would not make sense with Paul's unequivocal affirmations to you should not get divorced just previously. So yeah, Tatiana says the person. So yeah, she says bound as used in Romans 7:2-3 and 1 Corinthians 7:39, referring to the one flesh, is a different Greek word than the one used in 1 Corinthians 7:15, not under bondage. Yes, in that passage we see that a person is not obligated to be a slave/servant to this person who has chosen to leave/depart. Nowhere in that passage does Paul ever give permission to marry another. I'm inclined to agree with Tatiana and Pawson on this point. I think it's a hard teaching. Who can receive it? That's kind of what Jesus's audience said when he gave his teachings on divorce and remarriage, that it's better not to, get married. They said, well, if that's the case, then it's better not to get married. And then he said, well, whoever can receive this should receive it. But I am inclined to agree with him there. And I mean,
it's so hard. It's so hard for me because I think of the people I know who have gone through this, who are going through this. And I think that I'm okay with the idea of being able to hold two things in my mind, that I love them and care for them, and they're my friends, and yet they're committing adultery with their new partners, or if they go on get married again, that they'll be committing adultery, and this is something they shouldn't do. And I think I can hold those two things in my mind, right?
Right.
But the difficulty that I'm having is not wanting a new relationship for them. Like I want a new relationship because marriage and family and sex are so fantastic. They're gifts from God, and those things are, so I'll speak for me. They're so life-giving in my life that I would want that for someone, especially if they've been wronged in the first marriage and that was taken from them, and they didn't want it to be taken, but it was. And now, because that person did what they did, now they have to be single for the rest of their lives. That's hard. That's hard for me.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to spend some time working through that.
This was a conversation that Kirsty and I had pretty early on in our long distance relationship when we were dating on Divorce and Remarriage. We are 95% on the same page on this issue. And I think that's one of the challenges of this view is, and one thing that sticks out to me that she says on that point that you just highlighted is that we really want for people to be able to move on and to have a family and to have a new spouse, especially if they were the abused one.
But who isn't the abused one?
Right. Yeah. And so
who isn't the aggrieved party? Everybody's aggrieved. We've all grieved our spouses.
And I think the point that Kirsty had made to me in those conversations was life's not fair. And I think I will say this, one thing that I disagree with Pawson on is he seems to think that the second marriage is completely invalid, and that he seems to imply, and I don't think I'll play this section of what he says, you can go and listen to it for yourself, but he seems to imply that if you're in a second marriage, what does repentance look like for you? Maybe it probably means you dissolving that relationship, that unbiblical relationship. I disagree with that because of Deuteronomy chapter 24, the beginning of it, where, and he highlighted this in his talk, where the woman who the husband sends away and gives a certificate of divorce and goes to a second marriage and marries that man, if that man divorces her, or I think it might have even said dies, I'm not sure, that she's not then permitted to go back to the first. And so that principle to me communicates that the forming of a new covenant in the second marriage dissolved the first. That makes sense to me.
You've made a vow to another person.
And I don't think
whether you should have done that or not,
right here.
Right. Whether you should have done that or not is one question. And then whether you should now break this new vow is a different question.
Yeah. And I think, Susan, thanks for your reminder here. She says, I am reminding you, Drew. So on the point that you said, I think you said that your husband left in 1978 and he remarried in 1982. But then has since passed away, I think is what you said. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I would say that in his remarriage, it seems to me that him forming a new covenant then breaks the covenant. And then, obviously in this case, it would be you, but for anyone, that spouse is no longer a spouse. So then they are permitted to be free. And I think that this comes to the crux of the issue for me in terms of the gospel and God's relationship with us, and us really desiring to have a gospel-centered relationships and forgiveness and grace. And I know that's not easy. It's easy for me to sit here and say this. I know that. But I think the hope is that when something like that has happened, that you pray for reconciliation, you pray for that person. And there may be a certain point where that becomes impossible, right? But I think that that's the ideal. I understand that as the heart behind God's instructions on divorce and remarriage and what you should do. And even his own example of himself that we've looked at in the Old Testament there, that's my understanding of that.
I think that what we can agree on is that we have to, as a church, repent and call our leaders to repent and become the kinds of elders and lay leaders in our churches that take this seriously and prepare our churches for this. One thing that Pawson says is that churches never talk about this until there's a crisis. Well, then it's too late. And so to begin talking about this and preparing our churches for taking this stance and repenting of our baseline acceptance of polygamy, as long as somebody does it sequentially, as long as people are in a serial monogamy, we're okay. And then we need to repent of this and have a strong gospel of reconciliation for marriages, and that be the main thing. And then we may disagree in some of the other particulars, but to close that loophole and have, instead of the drive of, well, I can't judge anybody, or well, who am I to say, or this kind of thing, is to have the drive of telling people what Jesus said about divorce and remarriage, and making a gospel of reconciliation. And maybe the answer is you stay single for the rest of your life. Maybe the answer is you may have to let him go, but that doesn't mean you're free to go. And having this ethic, which is God's ethic, and pushing that as the principle to follow, notwithstanding some exceptions we might end up on. So,
agreed. It's part of beginning it. It's starting the conversation and agreeing that we need to do something about it. I wanted to answer Susan's question here. So I would agree you're not still, if he formed a new covenant, I would agree that you're not married anymore. And according to that principle of Deuteronomy 24, and we could look at it, I think that in that case, you're just not even permitted to go back to the first union. And I think that.
But what if Pawson was saying that was a Mosaic law thing, and that doesn't have anything to do with us?
I think that is what he was saying, but I think that we can draw the principle from that it seems likely that's what's happening, and likely that's why he says that the land would be defiled if this happened. It seemed to be another principle of a moral issue.
And this is another really good. Okay, yeah.
Okay, cool. I got ahead of you. You read it. Go ahead.
Oh, no,
I had a different one. Is this the one you wanted?
No, I had a different one.
I'll do this one and then you do the next one. So Aaron says, is the second vow accepted in the eyes of the Lord or only man? Sounds like this argument is a human one, the same as gay marriage vows are not accepted by God. I think that Jesus believed that the forming of the second covenant and consummation of it was adultery. But I think that new covenant is recognized by God and breaks the first covenant, and that two wrongs don't make a right, and that I don't think it would be biblical or wise. He goes on to say here at the end that there's not this prescriptive precedence thing. It's principles. There's different principles that we have to follow. And so hopefully that answers your question. If it feels like a human argument to you, that you're entitled to that opinion. But I think after studying this at length, I feel pretty confident of that. What were you going to say, Eric?
Well, Judge has a good point that singlehood is not a curse. I think what that gets at is a wider principle, again, in our churches, is that churches are so family oriented, and all the programs and everything like that is, I mean, maybe rightfully, right? This isn't wrong or sinful, that is geared towards children and family and things like that. And you can say that families are the bedrocks of churches, and maybe that is true and stuff, but that also churches don't know what to do with single people. Churches don't know what to do with, like, when was the last time you saw a pastor that was older than 25 and single? And be honest with yourself, if you did, you'd probably think he was a weirdo, right? Same thing with women, that if you saw, a woman who's over 25 and not married and didn't really plan on it, you'd be like, what's wrong with that person? Like we do have this bias against single people. We don't, and the church doesn't know how to program for it or what to do with them, or, that sort of thing. So I take that as a valid point too, something that is contributing to this, that we do see. We see not getting our sexual desires fulfilled as just impossible. No, I have to have my sexual desires fulfilled. What are you talking about? We see singleness as some sort of like deficiency or something. Yeah.
Right. Here, let's give him some concluding thoughts here.
We must not be intimidated by people. We need to fear the Lord rather than people. And then we'll do the right thing. It may be difficult, it may be costly, there may be high emotions in people, but we must do the right thing in the sight of the Lord, whatever the cost or consequence. I promised years ago to the Lord that after studying the word and listening to other interpretations of it, that when I came to my own understanding, I would tell it as I believed it is, regardless of cost or consequence. I've kept that promise, and there has been a cost, and there have been many consequences. Nevertheless, I want to be able to stand before God one day and say, I told them the truth, and I told them what I believed they needed to hear.
That's a good word. It's a challenging word there. We need to fear God and not people taking a firm stance on this, or even obeying the Lord in anything in our own lives on this point. If many of you are watching and have been divorced or remarried or something like that, pray into this, study this. Obviously, this is a really important subject. Aaron said here, whoops. Wow, where's that at?
That's right here.
Oh, okay,
thanks for
cool.
the super chat, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on Ezra 10, where they put your wives and children because their marriages, they put away their wives and children because their marriages weren't accepted in the eyes of the Lord? I think that's where they had married non-Jews, right?
Yeah.
They had married. Yeah.
Pawson, he talks about this in his book. Go ahead, Eric.
No, it's a good question. He talks. What does he say in the book?
I don't know, because I didn't get to that part. I was thinking about this, that, this is a whole can of worms, and I feel like we could do a proper beginning to end Bible study where we really get into this. It may be at a future stage. If you guys have really enjoyed this and you want to dig into this, then we can look at that. I'm happy to look this up and get back with you on what his answer is. I don't know. His book is called, you can see the title in the thumbnail. It's Remarriage is Adultery, Unless. That's the name of his book, by David Pawson. It's pretty good. It's actually pretty short, I think, but he gives a solid treatment of the different controversial things. I'm not sure, Aaron, about that passage. So unfortunately, thanks for the super chat with my answer.
Well, my thought with it is like, well, that sets a principle and a precedence at the very least. I don't know what it is to do with that. And if that's Mosaic law stuff, if that's New Covenant stuff, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But it is kind of a principle that we can at least think about and recognize that it sets a precedence for God commanding this at some point.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess it's worth acknowledging too, one thing that Pawson keeps coming back to is Jesus's words and Paul's words, and how they do seem to be unequivocal on the matter. And, taking that in light of that, I'm not sure, but it is a good question, and it is something that we need to take into consideration. Tatiana, thank you so much for your super chat here. It's definitely a hobby horse of ours, as you can probably tell. We got two Canadians in the chat. I think those are Canadian dollars. And but anyways, yeah, all of this is quite. I'm looking forward to how all of this comes together, because it's quite synergistic. Trigger word, with divorce and remarriage, church discipline, and biblical eldership. I feel like these are three things that I really like to continue to talk about and discuss with you all.
Yeah, right. I do feel challenged by this one and convicted by this one, and I'm seeing the effects of the church not getting this right, and it's devastating to families, and to women and men. And I think it leads into other things like church discipline, like singleness, and like sexual morality. You know, what's if marriage is nothing, if a covenant is nothing, if a marriage vow is nothing, which can be broken when you just no longer feel like it, or broken when your husband or your wife is mean to you, or when things get difficult, then what standing does the church have about sexual immorality? What makes sexual immorality wrong if marriage is just something that can be abandoned when things get tough? And I think the case could be made that our acceptance of no fault divorce and our view of divorce as a church is what led us to lose any sort of cultural currency in the gay marriage debate. The gay marriage debate came around, and we had no compelling case to make because we had already just let anyone get divorced and remarried for any reason for 30 years.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think this is probably a good point to close out. We're not closing yet, though, because I don't know why, actually. Thank you all for tuning in. It's I've been looking at the numbers here, and most of you have stuck around through us.
That's great.
This. We really appreciate it. Awesome. It's fun to interact with you live. I really wanted to do this live because we did have a number of you in chat with us last time. I think not very many of those same people were able to make it today, if I'm not mistaken, but if you were in that chat last time, we hope that this has been helpful to you. If you want to see more of this kind of content, we obviously love soteriology and talking about the Calvinism Arminianism debate, but we're passionate about ideas and their consequences and want to follow the truth where it leads and want to care for people's souls. And so that's part of what we want to do here too. Come join the patron team if you like. We have a patron Discord where we talk about this stuff. I put the thumbnails out for this and kind of was getting some feedback on, who likes this thumbnail or that or the other. And so that's all we have for today. We'll see you next time on the Provisionist Perspective.